Hello and welcome everyone to our final webinar for Drug-Free Work Week 2023. Our webinar today is hosted by the National Drug-Free Workplace Alliance. The program today is entitled Why to Include Voluntary Disclosures and Second Chance Agreements in Your Company's Substance Abuse Program. My name is Heather Horning. I am the program coordinator for NDWA, the National Drug-Free Workplace Alliance. Thank you all for joining us today. The National Drug-Free Workplace Alliance is a constituent of Drug-Free America Foundation, which is a drug prevention and policy organization committed to developing strategies and educational programs that prevent drug use and promote sustained recovery. There's a little bit about us there. If you haven't already done so, please feel free to introduce yourself, your organization, where you're from in the chat box. And also, we do ask that you please ask your questions in the Q&A box, and we will answer them as time allows. Usually we spend the last 10 minutes or so answering any questions. So if any pop up at any time, pop them in there, and we will be sure to get to them as we can. The webinar today will be recorded, and you will receive a link to it along with a certificate of attendance. And a survey will pop up right at the end of the webinar. Will also show up in an email coming in the next few days. And we would love if you could spend just a minute or two filling out that survey to let us know how things were and any future ideas that you might have. So let's get started. Today we are joined by Esther Miller. Esther is the marketing director for Drug-Free Business, which is a nonprofit 501c whose mission has been since 1988 to help employers, both large and small, realize a national drug-free workplace nationwide. This starts with having a well-written substance abuse policy, education and training for both employers and employees, and setting up drug testing protocols. Welcome, Esther, and I will turn over the screen to you.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning. So my name is Esther Miller, and I am with Drug-Free Business. But who is Drug-Free Business? As she said, we were established in 1988 as a nonprofit. And at that time, there really wasn't drug testing in businesses. And so one of our goals was to help create a way for employers to have a drug testing program. And we incentivized it by creating a 5% discount for workers' comp premiums. So those of you who are outside of the United States, so what you might not realize is that employers have an insurance plan that they have to adhere to. And the more accidents and injuries they have, of course, the higher their premiums are. So by instituting a drug-free workplace, we were hoping that that would help employers reduce their accidents and injuries, which in fact it did. And after 5 years, they didn't need that incentive anymore to be drug-free. They realized if they had a drug-free workplace, they would have less accidents, less injuries, less absenteeism, less theft, and just a better workplace for all of their employees. We started again in 1988, and it was a combined effort between Boeing, Weyerhaeuser, the DEA. In fact, our founder, Tom Poole, was an ex-DEA agent, undercover agent, the Sherwood Group, the state of Washington, King County. And basically, our goal was to help people maintain being drug-free. One of the things that happened in 1988 was the Federal Department of Transportation instituted the DOT regulations, so that if you were on a bus, or you were on a ferry, or you were working in a pipeline, or you were on a train, or sending your kids on a school bus, or on a public transit, you could be assured that those workers were drug-free and that you would have a safe journey. So why do we test it all? And yes, sir, ma'am?
Sorry, not to interrupt. Your presentation isn't up yet.
Oh, no. Okay, I'm seeing it.
I was enjoying your spiel, and I said, I bet you she's got that up. So go ahead and hit that share screen button at the bottom.
Okay, just a minute. Let's see. Okay. Well, I'm seeing it. Okay, I got it. Okay. All right. Let me okay.
And it should be the green button there down at the bottom.
Right. I'm not seeing my green button here. Hold on. Um, you know what, Heather? I also sent that to you.
I will
So
give you just 1 second. I will pull that up for you.
okay.
It's taking a second to load up on my side here.
Or wait a minute. Here we go. I can share the screen. Yeah. So hold on. I apologize.
No, that is all right. Webinars are never webinars without a few technical difficulties.
Okay, so I want to share this screen. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes, and then just go ahead and pop that into presenter mode.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so
Perfect.
so sorry for that. I
That's all
apologize.
right.
Okay, so a lot of people ask, why do we even test for drugs? Well, back in 1987, there was a huge train wreck. 17 people were killed, hundreds were injured. And honestly, it was because of marijuana. Both the engineer and the brakeman had marijuana in their system. And you have to realize at that time that marijuana only had a potency of about 4 to 5%. It was not that strong. So that was a pretty, horrible incident. And that's when the DOT regulations went into effect. We also had a Drug-Free Workplace Act that was put in place at the same time in the United States. And that required that companies that had federal funding or had federal contracts or those who were in federal positions had to have a drug-free workplace. And so that's where the regulations really started and why they started. And you wonder, well, why should you be drug-free? And of course, we're in a time in our life where we try to be healthy. People eat, clean food. They drink purified water. They walk. They do all these things to help and be a healthy person. We want people to have a healthy mind as well. And when you do that, you are more productive and alert to hazards. It's a good example for your family and your children. And what we find is that employees that are part of a drug testing program, that filters down into the ethos of their family as well. It also supports your community. And I don't know, everybody's community is different around the world, but we're seeing a big, big impact with fentanyl and other drugs of abuse that is, really affecting our communities. We want to support healthy lifestyles and also the values of the company of safety and excellence. And finally, it's better for the environment. There is a lot of waste that happens because of substance abuse manufacturing. It's very polluting to the environment and certainly another good reason to be drug-free. The other reason a company would want to be drug-free is because within the United States, 55% of all workplace fatalities had drugs or alcohol involved. 16% of all emergency room visits involve substance abuse. And nearly 50% of all of vehicle accidents in the United States with a fatality included drug or alcohol use. So it's a very, big reason why we want to encourage people to be drug-free. So if you are drug-free, how do you do that for your workplace? Well, one of the things you do is you have a policy. And that policy will have several elements into it. It includes education, not just of your supervisors, but of your employees, a drug and alcohol awareness training, You also have to have a testing mode. So how are you going to be testing your employees for drugs and or alcohol? You need to consider that. Collectors need to be trained. There needs to be a chain of custody. It needs to be fair to both the employee and the employer. That is the very biggest element of a drug-free workplace, is to make sure this is a fair system. In the United States, we use HHS certified labs. That's a lab that meets the accreditation for drug testing. We use medical review officers. That's a physician who's trained in substance abuse, but is also trained in the DOT regulations about how to have a fair drug test. And then finally, we have what we call the Voluntary Disclosure or EAP program. Now, some employers have this voluntary disclosure program and some do not. And I'm here to encourage you to include that, and we'll discuss that in just a few minutes. So your policy should include who's subject to the policy. Which employees does this apply to? What conditions are prohibited? Is that having drug paraphernalia on the job? Is that being under the influence on the job? What are your policies and what are your prohibitions? And also you'll need to determine when are you going to test your employees: pre-employment, random, post-accident, reasonable suspicion. How will they be tested? There's several ways you can test now. You can test with oral fluid. You can also test with urine testing. There's hair testing. So those decisions need to be made. And then what are your conditions for that voluntary disclosure? When I say voluntary disclosure, what I'm talking about is you have people within your organization who have a drug or alcohol problem right now. Every employer does. And many times it's a very shameful secret that they're carrying. You need to make your workplace a place where it's not shameful for them to disclose that they have a substance abuse problem, but this is a place where they can get help to overcome their problem. So let's talk about who's involved with the drug testing program. You may have safety sensitive workers. If you're in a police department, that's anybody who has a handgun. If you're working in a public works department, that may be people who are, working in the sewer department in confined spaces. If you're a construction company, that might be anybody who is on a ladder or is using scaffolding. It can be any of your employees. And you want to educate your employees on your policies, that you do have a drug testing program, that you are serious about it. You can adjust the panels that you use for pre-hire, depending on where you are, for oral fluid or for urine, and we can talk a little bit about that as well. And having the trained collectors, and again, your certified labs, medical review officer, and EAP program. Now, what is safety sensitive? That is a very vague term, and honestly, it is just in the United States anyway. Every single state has its own definition. In Washington state, a safety sensitive position for which impairment while working presents a substantial risk of death. That was a recent legislation that came to Washington state. That isn't the only definition, and in my opinion, any position where you could have a disabling injury or hurt somebody else on the job also would qualify as a safety sensitive position. So that's another reason that you want to include drug testing. So for death, it doesn't say whose death, but it could be anybody's death. If you're in a hospital and you have an anesthesiologist and they don't, and they're under the influence, they could accidentally forget to turn off the gas. And substantial risk of death, that can mean many things, but there are many types of jobs right now where there are recorded fatalities. And in Washington state, that includes road work, falls. Motor vehicle accidents are the #1 reason for workplace fatalities in the United States, and probably so in wherever you happen to be. So if you have anybody who's working for you, who's driving for you, that person is at risk to themselves or others if they're using drugs or alcohol. So again, you need to adjust your policy and then the reason for a disclosure. Now, one of the things you want to do is talk about how to use an EAP system. If you're not familiar with that term, it means Employee Assistance Program. And normally what that is, it's an extra benefit that employers give to their employees where they can confidentially disclose problems, not just drug problems, but maybe they have family problems. Maybe they're dealing with an elder care issue. Maybe they're dealing with a divorce in their family. Maybe they're dealing with something that's giving them unusual pressure on the job. And this is a place where they can contact someone confidentially, a counselor, have some counseling sessions, and maybe some resources given so that they can deal with that problem. The same thing applies to drug and alcohol. It's a confidential line. The employer is not aware of who is calling or why they're calling. It's for the employee to help resolve problems. So if you have an EAP service, that's a wonderful, wonderful resource, and it's going to help your employees deal with those personal issues. The other way is to have a voluntary disclosure program. And what that means is that the employee knows if they have a substance abuse problem and they reveal that to you before they're asked to do a drug or alcohol test, rather than after they've had a drug or alcohol test, meaning that they're not subject to a test. Let's say there's a random test coming up. If they say to you, John, you're selected for a random drug test. And John says, oh, yeah, but I was meaning to tell you I have a problem with, alcohol. I was going to come and tell you that. Well, John, that doesn't excuse you from your alcohol test. You'll still need to take that test, and then we'll see what happens on the results of that test. Now, if your company has what they call a second chance agreement, that gives them an opportunity to come back to work after they've had treatment, after they've had counseling, and after they are ready to return to work. So one of the things you want to do is make your employees aware of, do you have an EAP program? Do you have a voluntary disclosure program? And then also for supervisors, they need to be trained on how to do reasonable suspicion training. How do they know if an employee is under the influence of drugs or alcohol? Do they know how to determine that? Some places that's a given. If you're within a police department, you get special training for that. Other companies, you don't have that information. And so training for reasonable suspicion is very important. And then the other thing that you want to include in your program is, can an employee disclose to their employer if somebody around them is using drugs or alcohol? There's been many circumstances where an employee is working and they know that the person they're working with or close to has a substance abuse problem or is using drugs at work, and they're afraid. They're actually afraid because they might become injured because of their co-workers' actions. So is there a confidential way your employees can disclose that there's drugs or alcohol use on the job without retaliation? Is there a way for them to do that? You need to figure out how to do that. So again, that's part of your plan. Now, how you test employees, again, this is United States standards. It might be different from where you're coming from, but urine testing right now is the status quo. It's been around since 1988. It works very well. And the reason it works well is because it's the same in all 50 states. It's the same test, regardless of which lab that you use. It's very consistent, and it's a protocol that has been set up to be fair both to the employer and the employee. There's a fast turnaround. There's a broad network of where you can get these tests performed. There is some problems, though. People try to tamper with their tests. They will try to bring in a substitute or a fake synthetic urine, or perhaps they will bring in somebody else's urine, because most tests are not monitored, meaning they're not directly observed unless there's evidence of tampering or if the employee is on a follow-up or a second chance agreement. So one of the newer ways to test is through oral fluids. And this is actually a very simple way for an employer to administer drug tests because it's directly observed. The collector is looking directly at the employee. A swab goes into their mouth between their cheek and their gum that absorbs the saliva. That saliva then goes into a vial, which is sent to the laboratory for testing. And then once that test is performed, you have the same results. And one thing about oral fluid, it's very, very difficult to tamper with that test because you're being directly observed. What we found is that the positive rates for oral fluid are equal to or even higher than you get for urine testing because of the inability for people to tamper with that test. Some of the advantages is there's no bathroom required. So if you're in a remote area or where bathrooms are hard to come by, it's a easier test to do. Or if you need to do a test on the roadside, say you're doing roadside tests for drivers, etc. And again, it has the same type of accreditation through the HH labs and having an MRO officer. However, there is a shorter detection period. So when you're looking at oral fluid tests versus lab-based urine tests, you're looking at a shorter window of detection. So for example, for THC or marijuana, we're really looking for 48 hours, and that's for the actual THC, marijuana, not the metabolite. So again, it gives you a shorter window of detection, but that window of detection might be more appropriate if you're looking at reasonable suspicion or you're looking at post-accident. You want to know, did drugs or alcohol have anything to do with that particular situation? It's also a good detector for people that suspect employees might be using drugs on the job because it can detect drug use within minutes after a person has used drugs. So that is a very, very helpful tool. If you've got people who are vaping, for example, on their lunch breaks and you think they're vaping marijuana, but you're not sure, again, an oral fluid test can help you find that out. So again, most of these standards are based on the DOT standards. And if you are in the United States and you're not sure whether or not you have employees that would be covered by DOT, there is a website, dot.gov, Am I Covered? And it talks about the different agencies that are required to be under a federal drug testing program. Again, these new oral fluid levels have just come out, and they're very, very low. Now, a standard drug test panel includes marijuana, cocaine, opioids, including codeine, morphine, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, so Vicodin, Percocet, oxycodone, 6-man, that's looking specifically for heroin. It does not include fentanyl at this time. So if you want to test for fentanyl in your drug test panels, you should ask for that. You know, for DOT, it's not allowed in the panel yet. They'll probably add it. But for your non-DOT testing, for anything that's, you know, employer related, you can ask for fentanyl or any other drug of concern that's in your community. And then amphetamines and methamphetamine, and of course, MDA and MDMA. So to give you kind of perspective on how big of a nanogram is, 1 grain of sugar is 625,000 nanograms. So we're looking for a very minute amount of drugs in someone's system. Again, this is relating to DOT testing, but you'll be able to do it for any type of DOT test. And again, when you use oral fluid, we recommend that you use it for those situations where you're looking for the immediate use of a drug, and also as an alternate to a directly observed urine test. Directly observed urine tests can be quite invasive, and it also can be quite difficult to find a same-sex collector. So in some communities, most collectors in the United States are female. Most people who are safety sensitive, have work in the construction field, for example, are male. So sometimes that's a difficult fit. So there is, I'm going to go through these a little bit fast because this is not quite to our subject. But I just wanted to let you know that as an employer, there are protocols for both urine and oral fluid testing. So with urine testing, an employer has up to 3 hours to provide a specimen. And if there's an observed collection and no same-sex collectors available, you can now use oral fluid. And oral fluid, what they do is they just simply look in your mouth. They're looking for tampering agents. They put a swab in your mouth. And again, it takes up to 5 minutes and then goes into 2 vials and goes to the laboratory. The only problem you do have with oral fluid testing is that you might have what they call dry mouth. That's because the person's taking medication that might inhibit them from having saliva. And if that's the case, then a physician would have to verify that. The same thing if they had a shy bladder and couldn't go to the bathroom. Physician would have to verify that. So the DOT testing will be available sometime late 24 or early 25 for the oral fluid. And that's a good time also to include it for your non-DOT testing. So I want to talk about substance abuse disorder. What is that? Basically, it's when somebody has an overwhelming desire to use drugs or alcohol. There's really 3 phases. There's the discovery phase where people are experimenting with drugs, and then they find a drug that, suits them, helps them to relieve, anxiety or pain, or makes them feel less vulnerable. Then there's a tolerance phase where when they are using this drug, and what happens is it hits your dopamine transmitters, basically the feel-good hormones in your brain, the same thing that tells you, oh, this food tastes good, or whatever. It has a function. You need dopamine transmitters. But when you use them with drugs, what happens is that it overrides them. And then suddenly you need more and more of the same drug to receive the same amount of dopamine transmitters. And then what happens is your brain shuts down. You no longer feel pleasure. You no longer feel the same feeling that you got when you first started that drug. Now you're only maintaining your drug use. So you don't feel awful afterwards. And then you get into the place where you are addicted and your only thought is, when can I have more drugs or get more drugs? And your relationships start to suffer, your work starts to suffer, everything in your life starts to suffer. So it's important to know that anybody, doesn't matter if you're Black, white, old, young, anyone can have a substance abuse disorder, because drugs work the same way on everyone's dopamine transmitters. It's not going to, be that much different for any one person. So having a return to work plan and a place for voluntary disclosure is very important, because anyone can have a substance abuse problem. Your best worker can have a substance abuse problem. This is one of the ironic things, that sometimes you have someone who is, we call high functioning. They can be a high functioning alcoholic. They're doing their work well. They're getting along with their colleagues, but they can't get up in the morning without having a drink. They get the shakes if they don't. And, their life's in turmoil, but they're very resident to say so, because it would take away from the image of the successful person that they are. One thing that this does is, if you have a second chance agreement, is that your return on investment is going to be great, because you will have less turnover in the workplace. People who have a substance abuse problem are 36% more likely to be switching jobs or changing jobs often, because their habits catch up with them. So you want to use what we call, in the United States anyway, a substance abuse professional, both for your DOT and your non-DOT employees, for return to work plans. And what the substance abuse professional does is they oversee the process. They're not the counselor themselves, but they oversee the process to return the worker back to work safely. So what a SAP does is they have a written agreement for the employee before returning to work. And that might include treatment, participation in 12-step programs, random drug and alcohol testing. And then once they're at a point where they have this under control, then they have a return to duty test. And if that test is negative, they can go back to work. But they will continue to have random drug or alcohol tests once they have returned to work. You might ask, who pays for that? That's between the employer and the employee. In some cases, some employers pay for that. In some cases, some employees are required to pay for that. It's part of their return to work process. So that is a decision that you have to make between you and your employees, and of course, any unions that are involved. The continued random testing comes once the employees return to work. And normally that's at least a 12-month minimum, at least under DOT standards. It can be longer. Some programs are as long as 5 years. But the employee must not know how many follow-up tests or when the follow-up test plan expires. The whole idea of having this is to make sure that that employee continues to stay sober with the return to work plan. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to go to all that trouble? Well, because you'll have a recovered worker. And a recovered worker is a good example for their family and their children. It supports your community. If you're tired of seeing people that are, suffering from substance abuse in society, then be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. Don't turn a blind eye. A lot of employers, if they have an employee who has a positive drug or alcohol test, they just kick them to the curb and say, you're out. We don't need you anymore. So you want to represent your company's values of safety and excellence. With a recovered worker, you can do that. It's better for your environment. Again, substance abuse and the way drugs are manufactured, especially cocaine and fentanyl and a lot of drugs that use precursor agents, horrible for our environment. And it's better for your company, There are other resources. This is some links. And with this program, you'll be able to click on the link. If you're within the United States, you can find treatment. You can find a substance abuse professional. You can find help with self-help groups. And this is a great resource for commonly used drugs. Anybody, anywhere within the United States or outside the United States certainly can use this to look up different drugs of abuse, what they do, what they are, what they look like, etc. So I hope all of this has been helpful to you. And I see we might have some questions. Yes?
We did just have one pop up here. It's from Syed. I apologize if I not saying that correctly. They ask, can we apply drug use prevention interventions in workplace areas on a monthly basis? They're also working in different factories and offices.
I think what you're asking is, can you do random testing on a monthly basis? Is that what I'm hearing? Is that correct?
I believe so. It might also be referencing the fact that they have people working in multiple areas and they want to make sure that this is being handled on a regular basis.
As long as it's not illegal with regulations with your country, I would say yes, you absolutely can. And so every country has its own regulations about drug and alcohol testing as it relates to the individual and or companies. So there may be, I doubt that there is a problem with that in your community, but I certainly could look into it and find out for you. So let me ask around. Yes, testing is important, but you're talking about education. Absolutely. Actually giving education in bite-sized pieces. 1 month you could be talking about marijuana. 1 month you could be talking about cocaine. 1 month you could be talking about your EAP program. 1 month you could be talking about how drugs, influence children, for example. There's a lot of good resources on that. So absolutely keeping those topics first and foremost in the forefront for your employees is a great way to do it, and to do it in bite-sized pieces rather than to sit them down and make them go through a presentation that'll last a half an hour and then that's it for the whole year. I think that's a brilliant idea. It's a great idea. Absolutely. Do I have any other questions? Okay. Heather, do you have anything else that you would like to add?
No, what I will do is I'll ask you to put down your presentation for the moment.
Yep. Okay, let me do that.
Back over. And of course, if anyone has any further questions, I'm gonna vamp for a little bit to give you a second to pop those in there.
Okay.
All right. People just a moment to see if anything else pops up for us here. Esther, we really do appreciate you sharing your expertise about the importance of a second chance program as part of our substance abuse policies in the workplace. There's a lot of information. And as a reminder to everyone out there, we will be sharing this presentation. So you can kind of take a look over everything, check out those other resources.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. It's wonderful to see people around the world are getting together, not just the United States, to embrace a drug-free workplace and a drug-free lifestyle. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So our final little spiel here for myself, the National Drug-Free Workplace Alliance is one of those programs that can help you set up a drug-free workplace program. We provide trainings. So please, if you have you want to find any more information about that, any questions, you can contact myself at nidwa.org. You can contact Esther at Drug Free Business. I'll make sure that their presentation and their information will be sent along in the follow-up email. You can find Drug Free America and NIDWA at any of these social media sites here. We appreciate your time. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you all for joining us. A survey will appear at the conclusion of the webinar. We'd appreciate it if you would complete it. When again, we will provide you with the links to the recording and a certificate of attendance in the next few days.
All right, thank you.
Thank you again, Esther. This concludes the webinar. Everyone have a fantastic rest of your day.